Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sulani Madsen, reading last week's column, inspired by the debate over the statue of Ensign John Monaghan. Context and interpretation really makes the difference as we examine old monuments and consider the stories we thought we knew. First, this column, as published Thursday, July 6th, 2023 in the Spokesman Review, headlined, "This Immigrant's Story Has Many Layers and Complexities." History is more than a timeline of truths and facts. It is the lived experience of people, full of joy, tragedy, and irony. When told well, it connects with our own history. Perhaps the story of these two men will resonate with your experience of the world. He was the beloved son of an immigrant father. Like many of the second generation, eager to show gratitude to the country that had been so good to his family, perhaps eager for adventure, he sought out an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy after graduating from Gonzaga. After commissioning, the young ensign found himself involved in a battle that didn't belong to him, in a foreign nation where America's interests were murky, but where his duty was clear. He came to the defense of a wounded comrade without regard for the danger to himself. We honor men and women for such actions. The setting could have been Afghanistan, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Vietnam. For Ensign John Monaghan, it was a civil war in Samoa. His father, James Monaghan, arrived in New York from Ireland in 1856. He was 16, an economic migrant from famine and the passage of the repressive Peace Preservation Act imposed by the British government. Or perhaps he was also a young man eager for adventure. James Monaghan left the East Coast and arrived in Washington State via the Isthmus of Panama before there was a canal. According to local historian Kurt Carlson, the elder Monaghan built a variety of entrepreneurial ventures in the area not yet known as Lincoln, Stevens, and Spokane counties, starting with a ferry across the Spokane River in the vicinity of what is now known as Long Lake Dam. For James, the loss of his son in a conflict between the superpower he'd fled and the emerging superpower of his adopted country must have been heartbreaking. History unfolds in layers as time adds context and insight. James Monaghan became an investor in mines, president of banks, builder of edifices, founder of the St. Vincent de Paul Society for Relief after the Great Fire of 1889, signer of the original city charter for Spokane in 1891, and grieving father. Now, some would dismiss the John Monaghan statue as a story about a rich kid with a problematic plaque. Thousands of American families have found themselves mourning a beloved son or daughter under similar circumstances over the past century. Emily Jacobs is the interpretive program manager with Washington State Parks. She is working with the Washington State Historical Society on the statewide review of monuments and their place in history. Quote, "Interpretive signage needs to connect history with our lives today," Jacobs said. "There's many sides to every story. We're always adding new layers of understanding," end quote. The Monaghan statue provides an opportunity to add another layer to the story of the sacrifices of our U.S. military and their families, and to Samoan history. The website samoa.travel, Discover Our History, describes the invasion of Samoa by Tongan warriors about 950 AD and ongoing battles between villages for control of the coastline, resulting in many years of Pacific wars over the next 3 centuries. The Samoan civil wars of succession invited competing interests from Germany, the UK, and the US to take advantage for control of territory in the Samoan Islands. The UK apparently backed off, and the Germans and Americans split the islands. The Germans were later forced to retreat from the Pacific after losing a European war. The Americans stayed. Historical monuments are an invitation to connect to the ways our society has changed. In 1906, when the Monaghan statue was placed, the immigrant story was unremarkable, and Samoa was an unimaginably foreign place. The U.S. was just beginning to dabble in the foreign entanglements President George Washington warned us about in his farewell address. Immigration is now a focus for contentious debate. American Samoa is famous as the birthplace of excellent football players, and we have committed many more generations of our sons and daughters to face warfare in places far from home for uncertain political goals. Washington State's review of monuments and their interpretation is engaging tribal communities to bring their stories into our shared history. Quote, rather than replacing monuments, it's an opportunity to start conversations with people who haven't been part of the narrative, Jacob said. It's an opportunity to add layers and insights to our history. I've been planning to get to the subject of the Monaghan statue since last year. The battle in Samoa came after the Spanish-American War, when we were tussling with other colonial powers in the Pacific over deepwater ports necessary for recoaling ships. But the bottom line is, a local boy joined the military, was sent someplace far away by his government for reasons that were not under his control, found himself in a firefight with people who already lived there and were already fighting amongst themselves, was wounded, his buddy was wounded, and he stuck with his buddy and defended him. In any battle, a soldier doesn't fight for his country as much as he fights for the comrade next to him. And after spending last week listening to battlefield stories in Gettysburg, I'd say it's a story that could be told in any war in any era. War is a hellishly stupid human enterprise, a virus we can't seem to shake. While it can bring out the worst in human behavior, it can also be an opportunity for individual deeds of self-sacrifice deserving of respect. And in Monaghan, the local boy did the right thing in staying with his buddy. At last week's Braver Angels National Convention in Gettysburg, I participated in a debate on the question, resolved, should we take down all monuments to slaveholders? Well, all or nothing are extreme positions, and everyone who spoke had some exceptions to their position, whether they began as primarily pro or con the resolution. No one suggested removing the Washington Monument. Several folks made a point of the origins of public statues to Confederates in southern states as having been intended as ominous reminders to reinforce Jim Crow restrictions. Others pointed out that even if they started that way, they often came to mean something else to the community. Braver Angels, most of our workshops recognize that the way to depolarizing our politics is to build relationships across boundaries. That takes physical connection, context, and background information. And I decided to participate in that debate as I was listening, and here's my rough notes of what I said. Going back to some statements that were made about how sometimes these things will be forgotten. Regensburg in southern Germany, it was a Roman outpost, and on one side of the Danube River was the Roman Empire in all of its civilized glory, and on the other side was the barbarians. It rose to great wealth because of it being on the trade route of the Danube, and eventually there was a toll bridge that they built, a stone toll bridge that was contributed to that wealth. But even 2,000 years later, there is a saying, don't marry over the bridge. Those memories of those separations, those do hang on into memory for a long time, especially when there's something that you can attach them to. There was also a museum there, and this is Regensburg is just over the hill from Adolf Hitler's Berchtesgaden. So it's right in the neighborhood. It has the Bavarian Museum of History, and as we toured through there, here's this whole timeline with all the facts of the things along the development of Regensburg from its ancient origins to the present day. The weird thing was it had these gaps when it got to World War I and World War II. Some pretty significant gaps. There was nothing in the museum that was false. It just was missing information, and there was nothing there to tag it to. There weren't mementos or statues or anything to make you ask the question about, so what about those Nazis? And it was fairly obvious that was uncomfortable, and it really was glossed over. In fact, one of the largest parts of the exhibit, just as you left at the end of World War II, was a U.S. Army Jeep for the liberators of Bavaria. It's an interesting take on history. Also on that same trip in Budapest, there is a place called Memento Park where the Hungarians, after much debate, as we are starting to have in this state and in this country over what to do with statues from the Soviet era, has moved a number of statues that were debated individually in neighborhoods in the city to decide what to do with each one of them. And they were moved to Memento Park, where a number of them are put up on display and have interpretive signage that lets you know where they were, why they were decided to be moved. And some of them are there just kind of representing different categories of why things were moved. One of them that had caused the greatest amount of discussion was one that had become very familiar to everybody, and it was supposed to be something like heroic soldier waving banner, and so it's this guy running, and he's got this banner in his hand, and but what it had come to be known by the populace, the neighborhood called it coat check clerk saying, "Did you forget your scarf?" So statues can change how they relate to the neighborhood. There was one that had been in a corner, very much like Monaghan is. It's just there in the middle of a traffic circle. Most people just went by and weren't paying much attention, but it was a landmark for people in Budapest. That was where you went to hitch a ride if you wanted to go out to the lake for the day, and so to get out of town. And that one, big debate. Do we keep it? Because now it has this entire other meaning and function in our community. So these are not unusual debates to be having. But in every case, I would say that when you take those statues out of their context, when you remove them from the background and the setting where they were, then they really lose some of their usefulness as a memento to remind us of our full complexity of our history. If I were to go down to the southeastern U.S. is, I am I realized as I was at this conference how much of a Westerner I am, born and raised in Washington. The southeastern U.S. is just this complete cloud. I don't understand that history. It's easier for me to understand the history of southern Germany than it is to understand the history of the southern U.S. And so if I were to go down to the southern U.S. and there was nothing there to trigger my question, how would I even know that Jim Crow existed? How would I know that was a part of an oppressive system? How would I know about the role that statuary played in the community if I didn't see it in the community, if it was relegated to, as Memento Park's statues were, to a place that was at the end of a bus line where only real history geeks are going to go find it? For those that are casually visiting or new to a community, it's those kinds of things. It's those public mementos that tell us something about our past, and they require interpretation, they require information, and they can serve a very useful purpose in keeping us connected. And like every other Brave Angel style debate that I've listened to or participated in, there's always new information that enriches my point of view. And I found it in that debate. It's in exercising that curiosity that we discover the complexity of the policy problems facing society. There's very often no absolute all or none answer, but there has to be some compromise so that we can live together. And we can't find a way to resolve that complexity with workable solutions unless we can see it first. Sometimes that means actually seeing a statue to trigger asking who, what, when, and why questions. When we do have a point of principle on which we have legitimate, deep-felt disagreement, we need to face that as well. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe, free or with a pledge, for a notification of new content. Send any ideas for future columns, commentaries, or interviews to the address listed on the Substack, and I'll see what I can do.